Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that I would review this little video about Dante's vaccination because I thought that it would be a very interesting topic. I really like debates. I really like overall kind of certain things to where, either I have to expose narratives or I like, sort of some debates overall to debate about. I'm somewhat competitive. And that's why I overall like sports, not only because I'm decently competitive, but I also really am a big fan of art expression. I think overall that it really, really is very important. And this comes in a multitude of ways. I think all in all that sports, I think all in all that they're that they're a great, art expression. I think when it comes to drawing or painting or that type of art, literal art, I think that that's a great way to express it. I've always been someone interested in that. When it comes to movies or story writing or certain things like that, I've always been very interested in that. I love to watch a bunch of classic films and stuff like that. I also love music. I love music overall, as I'm sure does everybody else. When it comes down to it, my point being is this: I think art expression, when it comes down to it, no matter how you express your art or how you express yourself, I think all in all that, it just tends to be very entertaining. And all in all, I really, really love art almost no matter what way it is expressed. And boxing is one of my favorite arts, no matter what else we compare it to. Boxing is one of my favorite arts of all time. Boxing is one of my favorite sports of all time. It is debatably my favorite sport of all time. It has a great amount of variety. It has a great amount of champions. It has a great amount of competitiveness, a great amount of styles. And all in all, when it comes down to it, boxing is just a sport that I really fell in love with a very, very long time ago. And it's certainly one of those things that grabbed a hold of me, as I'm sure it grabbed a hold of you, maybe when you watched it. And I just was never able to let this sport go. Boxing is just one of those sports overall to where I really, really enjoy watching it. And I'm probably going to be watching it until the end of my days when it comes down to it. So it is what it is. But anyways, when it comes down to it, Dante's Boxing Nation, he's going to be talking about all in all who he believes is the greatest fighter of this generation or, this past generation. So pretty much who has been the greatest fighter of the past 20 years. And when it comes to that question, it pretty much comes down to one or two people. It's either going to be the American, Floyd Mayweather Jr., or it's going to be the Filipino, Manny Pacquiao. And in my opinion, overall, I think that both of these guys, I think that both of them are all-time great fighters. Both of them you can debate were at one point in time certainly with the number one pound-for-pound fighter and the best fighter overall in boxing when it came down to it. Both have a claim to be, certainly in the top 10, of all time. And all in all, I just think that they're great fighters. But we're going to be talking about, all in all, who, in my opinion, is a greater fighter. Dante's also going to talk about it as well. We're also going to talk about some of the other great fighters of this generation as well, whether that be Tyson Fury or Andre Ward or some of the other fighters even from the 2000s, so maybe even the Joe Calzaghe or a Bernard Hopkins, and they kind of got started up in the 90s, but, they also won some of their bigger fights in the 2000s, even some of them in the 2010s, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to go through that. But anyways, when it comes down to it, let's just get into it. Let's see overall what this guy has to say. Let's see what Dante has to say. Let's get into it.
Mayweather is no doubt about it. In my mind, in Mosley's mind, in anybody's mind now, that he is the best. He keeps on proving it over and over and over again. And tonight convinced me, I have to say the truth, convinced me that he is the best. Possibly, there's obviously a lot of people who will say and who can argue this, but of all time, Mayweather has the skills to beat anybody. He has the talent, he has the work ethic, and people all over the world are becoming fans of the talent he possesses, so we really have to commend him for that. If anybody...
When you talk about, when you talk about in terms of best fighter that I've ever seen in terms of all-around talent, Floyd Mayweather Jr. overall does have to be in that conversation. When you talk about not only greatest fighter that I've seen, but most talented fighter that I've seen just all across the board, and on top of it, the accomplishments that he has, he certainly is up there as the greatest fighter of all time. No doubt about it. He's certainly within that debate. Now, I think debating the greatest fighter of all time, at least definitively, that's a little bit of a hard case because there are certain, different generations and people fought differently back then. And on top of that, certain sports sciences have been learned about today. And on top of that, certain people back then, they didn't always just, fight once or twice a year or 3 times a year. Sometimes they fought damn near 20 times a year. So sometimes maybe if a person had a loss here or there, it can be somewhat understandable, so it is what it is. But anyways, when it comes down to it, all in all, is Floyd Mayweather Jr. debatably in that conversation as greatest of all time? No doubt about it. No doubt about it.
Follow my career here. You always know that I fucking fought the best. That's all I have to say.
This dude, Oscar De La Hoya, man, this dude still very clearly has a drinking problem behind the scenes. And, I'm not necessarily sure 100% if it's because he just, I do think all in all he partially misses boxing. I do think overall that he wants to get back in the ring. That's why he's calling out some of these guys, like he called out Floyd Mayweather Jr. recently. But I think that there's a part of Oscar that also is somewhat depressed. Because even though Oscar De La Hoya, he was a great fighter, he did lose some of the bigger fights in his career. Oscar De La Hoya was a great fighter, first ballot Hall of Famer, no doubt about it. But Oscar De La Hoya, some can argue that he actually lost more big fights in his career than he actually won. At least when you talk about those A-grade fighters. I'm talking about the A-grade fighters, like the Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s, the Shane Mosleys, the Felix Trinidads. Now, some of those fights you could debate could have went Oscar's way, like against Felix Trinidad in the rematch against Shane Mosley. And he even gave Floyd Mayweather Jr., even at his age at that point in time, a tough run for his money. But Oscar, at one point in time, he was certainly flawed. And you can actually argue that there's a couple fights in his career that he won that he possibly should have lost. Like against Felix Sturm and also against, what the hell is that dude's name? Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker.
And who's the best? Floyd Mayweather.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So I got some news that's about to really hurt the racist fans' feelings right now. Floyd Mayweather has just been...
I love how Dante's Boxing Nation, once again, he always tries to separate himself from the racist. He tries to act overall like he's not a racist. Like, come on, dude. It is what it is. Just accept it.
Rated as the greatest fighter of all time. He was already rated as the greatest fighter of this era before this. But now, he's been rated as the greatest fighter of all time by BoxRec.com.
I'm not a big supporter of BoxRec.com because when I take a look at their ratings, I don't think that they personally know what the hell they're ranking. I think all in all that they don't know what the hell they're talking about. I mean, if you take a look at their pound-for-pound list, like last year, they had Alexander Povetkin in the top 10 pound-for-pound. Like, what the hell are you talking about when it comes down to it? Like, Boxing Rec don't know what the hell they're saying. But it is what it is.
Makes sense, and I'm going to break it down. But what doesn't make sense is they have Manny Pacquiao at number 2. That is completely ridiculous. But we're going to talk about that later on in this video.
I don't think all in all that it's completely ridiculous. Would I necessarily 100% agree with him being at number 2? I think you could argue it, but there are some people all in all that you could debate over him. My point being is this, like I said, it's very hard for me to debate all in all at least who is in the top 10 or, all in all, which exact order I would have it in. It's a little bit different from other sports. So I can't necessarily rank it like I would NFL quarterbacks or NFL players or NBA players or something like that. It's a little bit different in an individual sport and also in boxing. Boxing is a very, that list is very fluid in my opinion. My top 10 to 15 boxers would look something like this. Floyd Mayweather Jr. would be up there. Manny Pacquiao would be up there. I think Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, and Roberto Duran could debatably be there. Roy Jones Jr. I think Sugar Ray Robinson would be there. Am I missing someone else? Manny Pacquiao, of course, if I didn't mention him, and Floyd. Am I missing someone else? Muhammad Ali, I think, could debatably be there. Rocky Marciano, Lennox Lewis. Am I forgetting someone else? I'm trying to think. Julio Cesar Chavez, you could debate there as well. Those would pretty much be my top 10 to top 15 people in no particular order. If I really wanted to rank them in a specific order, I would really have to look at them individually. Like, that would be a video for another time. But those are the boxers that I would include personally within my top 10 to top 15 of all time. Marvin Hagler, if I didn't say him, all those guys.
Let's talk about Floyd Mayweather first. Those two clips that I played with Oscar De La Hoya talking. The first clip...
And I've seen Bernard Hopkins all in all ranked at number 6. I have no idea how the hell this man is ranked so high. Don't get me wrong, Bernard Hopkins was a great fighter in his own right, but when you talk about skill set and even his accomplishments, I understand all in all that he unified the middleweight division, and he even had some decent wins in his career, like over Oscar De La Hoya and Felix Trinidad. But besides those 2 wins where you clearly outsized those guys, what big fights did you really truly win in your career? And I'm not talking about the John Pascals and those guys. Those are good wins. Don't get me wrong. John Pascal is a decent fighter. You can even debate him as an A-class fighter if you want to. But is John Pascal ever going to be looked at as, a top 10 pound-for-pound overall fighter? I mean, let's just be real about Bernard Hopkins here for a second. Usually when he fought fighters that were decently talented and that were also near his same size, he usually lost. Whether it be against Roy Jones Jr. or Chad Dawson or Jermaine Taylor or Joe Calzaghe, he lost to every single one of those guys. Like Bernard Hopkins, he cannot be in my top 10, top 15 of all time. It's just not possible. Because I know even with Manny Pacquiao, sure, he had several losses in his career, but when we take a look at Manny Pacquiao, the majority of the time, at least 90% of the time, 90 to 80% of the time, when Manny Pacquiao was in a big A-class fight or against a champion, he won. Bernard Hopkins, I give him credit overall. He had those certain amount of title defenses at middleweight, but let's be real. Besides Trinidad and Oscar De La Hoya, who else do we remember that he beat there that was super duper good? I mean, I guess he also got that win over Kelly Pavlik, but besides those guys, I mean, who really in all reality did you beat that was super duper A grade? And even Kelly Pavlik, to a degree, I can't necessarily 100% say was, in my opinion, the most impressive fighter. But it is what it is.
As you guys seen that...
Like, when I take a look at Bernard Hopkins, I think that he's a great fighter. Don't get me wrong, but when I take a look at Bernard Hopkins, to put someone in the top 10, pound for pound all time, that would mean that, to me, debatably, you were at least 100%. So if you're a heavyweight, you were 100% the best of your generation in that division. 100%, no doubt about it. And if you're a fighter that was not in heavyweight, then what that means is that you were debatably the number 1 pound for pound fighter of your era, at least at one point in time. Was Bernard Hopkins ever looked at as the number 1 pound for pound fighter of any era? I don't personally think he was. Now, some people may disagree. But, if we're talking about the 90s, that has to be Roy Jones Jr. If we're talking about the 2000s, that has to be Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Manny Pacquiao. And if we're talking about the 2010s, I don't even think Bernard Hopkins was on there. So it is what it is. I don't even think he was on the top 10 pound for pound list. I like Bernard, to a degree, but come on, man. He's not a top 10 fighter of all time. I don't even think he'd be within my top 20. Because let's just be real, once again, all those fighters that I just named, is Bernard Hopkins above any of those fighters? Is he above Floyd Mayweather Jr.? Is he above Manny Pacquiao? Absolutely not. Is he above a Carlos Monsoon? That's one person that I forgot. Absolutely not. Is he above, a Rocky Marciano? Absolutely not. Is he above a Lennox Lewis? Is he above a Muhammad Ali? Is he above overall a Julio Cesar Chavez or Roberto Duran? A Sugar Ray Leonard? A Marvin Hagler? Is he above overall some of these guys? A Sugar Ray Robinson? Any of these guys? Absolutely not. I'm sorry. Roy Jones Jr., he's not above any of these guys.
In 2000...
It's so embarrassing that I see on some lists that Bernard Hopkins is actually counted as a greater fighter than Roy Jones Jr. That's just so stupid. Do people not remember that Roy Jones Jr. was probably, debatably, the most dominant boxer in boxing history, at least during this time? Now, if you want to debate all in all that maybe some of that wasn't the greatest competition, that's your business. But when it comes down to it, Roy Jones Jr. was the number 1 pound for pound fighter for literally several years. Bernard Hopkins was never even the number 1 pound for pound fighter once in his career. How can you rank him above Roy Jones Jr.? That's just stupid.
2010, that was at the post-fight press conference right after Floyd Mayweather dominated Sugar Shane Mosley. Now, it's important to note that at the time that Floyd Mayweather fought Shane Mosley, fans were accusing Floyd of ducking Shane Mosley. Shane was
That's true.
considered the #1 welterweight in the world. It was kind of like Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence, where there was always a debate on who the best welterweight was. Not only was Shane Mosley...
You know, I can't 100% pinpoint that because I was not watching boxing really at the time, at least not fully invested in it. I would have to look at that for myself, though, because to say that Shane Mosley was debatably the #1 welterweight in the world, I'm not so sure about that because Shane Mosley had already suffered a few losses in his career. I mean, you know, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there were some people trying to debate it because he beat Antonio Margarito, but I don't think that it would be quite the same debate as like a Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. because both of those fighters, when you take a look at their skill set, they're both somewhat on that same level. And on top of that, you know, neither of them have suffered a loss in their career. I mean, you know, I'm not saying that some people didn't do that, but, you know, would I say that it was really a debate at the time? No, not really, because Shane Mosley, before he fought Floyd, he lost to Miguel Cotto and a couple of other guys.
Considered the #1 best welterweight in the world at the time, he was also on the pound-for-pound list. He was rated as...
And I believe that because he was coming off of a very good win over Antonio Margarito. And if you want to see, if you're ever a person overall that, you know, wonders, one of the biggest ass whoopings that ever happened in boxing history, and if you ever, you know, you're in a violent mood and you just want to see a big ass whooping, look up Shane Mosley versus Antonio Margarito. That man beat the shit out of that man. He beat the hell out of Antonio Margarito. And let me tell you what, couldn't happen to a better person with that scumbag Antonio Margarito, you know, using them damn hand wraps. But it is what it is. And I do believe that he used them. It is what it is.
Pound for pound, one of the best fighters in the world, top 10. Floyd Mayweather completely dominated him. Now, what makes what Oscar De La Hoya said about Floyd Mayweather so impactful, so deep, is the fact you seldomly hear boxers admit that their rival is the greatest fighter of all time. Joe Frazier, he never said this about Ali. Neither did Sonny Liston. Neither did George Foreman, right? Tommy Hearns, Hagler, Duran, they never said this about Sugar Ray Leonard. So it's a hell of an endorsement when someone like Oscar De La Hoya says it. And remember, he said this over 10 years ago, and then I played the clip of him saying it again recently. And that's with him not even liking Floyd Mayweather personally. That's when you know he's being...
Just to speak about Shane Mosley and Oscar De La Hoya real quick, who in my opinion were two first ballot Hall of Famers. But there also is a reason why they lost so many big fights in their career. Because Shane Mosley, what I always noticed about him is that even though he is a very decent fighter, he seems to be a plan A fighter. And what I mean by that is that, you know, he usually sticks to one type of style. He usually loves to use that double jab and then come in there with the right hand. He has some other weapons as well. You know, he has a decent arsenal. But if you get around that, you pretty much have Shane Mosley. Shane Mosley is one of the all-time great fighters. Don't get me wrong. He is a clear A-class fighter. But there is a reason why Shane Mosley lost some of the bigger fights in his career. It's not like he just lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr. He also lost to Miguel Cotto, in my opinion, quite clearly. He lost to Vernon Forrest, I believe, twice. I think he even lost to Winky Wright when it came down to it. If I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. You know, I thought he also should have lost to Oscar De La Hoya in the rematch. Oscar was another great fighter. He won some big matchups in his career. He also lost quite a few. There was a reason why he lost to Floyd, even though he gave him a run for his money. You know, he lost to Felix Trinidad. Now, that one was a bit debatable because Felix Trinidad, you know, he did not handle guys with superior movement very, very well. At least he didn't handle Oscar very well in that fight. But Oscar, you can debate, maybe gave up some points in the final rounds because maybe he did not throw enough as much as he should have. But that's up to you. Some would also debate that he lost to Pernell Whitaker. And who the hell was that one fighter? Was it Ike Corte or maybe it was someone else? I personally haven't watched that fight, so I would have to watch it on my own. But Oscar De La Hoya, although he was a great fighter, he also did lose some of the bigger matchups in his career. Oscar was a very, very talented fighter. But all in all, you can argue that Oscar De La Hoya, that he actually kind of underachieved in his career. And some people may think that that's a very very, very risky statement for me to make, but I don't think it is. There were some big matchups that Oscar was favored to win, and he all in all did not end up winning them. It is what it is.
Honest. Of course, in that clip, I don't know if you guys noticed, but he was a little tipsy, so the truth was really coming out when he was talking about that. Floyd Mayweather has the most impressive resume in boxing history in terms of dominance, in terms of dealing with adversity, dealing with so many different styles. I mean,
I don't agree with that, but the thing that's most impressive about Floyd Mayweather Jr. to me is his resume. He's beaten so many great fighters. When I take a look at it, he's beat Manny Pacquiao, who's a first ballot Hall of Famer. He beat Shane Mosley and Oscar De La Hoya, who were first ballot Hall of Famers. Miguel Cotto, Ricky Hatton, Juan Manuel Marquez, even Canelo Alvarez. All those guys are all-time great fighters. Floyd defeated every single one of them. Even some of the other guys that maybe aren't looked at on that same level, like a Diego Corrales or, Jose Luis Castillo or a Marcos Maidana. They were still very elite champions. Or a Carlos Baldomir, Zab Judah, they're probably even a level below. But when it comes down to it, Floyd beat so many great fighters throughout his career, no doubt about it. Andre Berto, a couple other fighters that I may not be remembering were, Robert Guerrero.
If you look at all of the greatest fighters of all time, look at all the styles that Floyd Mayweather had to defeat. From a Manny Pacquiao, to a Canelo Alvarez, to a Ricky Hatton, to a Zab Judah, to a Shane Mosley, right? And I'm only naming a...
That's what makes an all-time great fighter or an all-time great athlete, when they can adjust to almost any situation. You cannot be a one-trick pony like a Deontay Wilder. You cannot be someone overall that has only one way of winning.
View to a rough and rugged Marcos Maidana and even a Castillo. Let's not forget Oscar De La Hoya, who had height and tremendous hand speed. Not to mention, he was like 20 pounds bigger than Floyd Mayweather the night of the fight as well.
I'm not sure how big he was. I don't know. I would have to look at that. Excuse me. Let me say this, because there's certain rumors overall that I've heard from certain channels or certain people where, they clearly like Floyd Mayweather, and they say, oh, well, Floyd, he was so great because the majority of people that he fought were like 20 pounds heavier. That's a bunch of horse shit. Floyd, he did fight some fighters that may have been very close to 20 pounds heavier. Like Victor Ortiz, he was pretty heavy. I think Oscar De La Hoya was pretty decently heavy, and I'm not sure Canelo Alvarez what his weight was, but let's also be real, Canelo, he had a rehydration clause. So I'm not even sure if he was 20 pounds heavier. But the majority of fighters that Floyd Mayweather fought, they were bigger than him in terms of weight. There's no doubt about that. But this narrative that, every fighter that he fought, or, the majority of fighters that he fought were so much more bigger and 20 pounds heavier, that's a bunch of horse shit. Like, Floyd fought fighters like Miguel Cotto and Manny Pacquiao and, some of these guys to where if they did weigh more than him, it was maybe 10 to 13 pounds. Like, it wasn't no damn 20 pounds. Some of the fighters out there, but that happened a very little amount of the time.
Speaking of fighters being bigger than Floyd, a lot...
Because Floyd rehydrates at about 157 to 150. Some of these fighters like Manny Pacquiao, he rehydrates at about the same. Miguel Cotto rehydrates at about 160. Marcos Maidana at his heaviest rehydrated at 160. Canelo, I'm not even sure where he was at because he had a rehydration clause, I believe, overall, and had to meet him at a catch weight. And there's a couple of other things as well.
Out of his opponents,
Shane Mosley was never a natural welterweight either, I believe, all in all. Well, maybe later on he kind of built into it, but, Shane Mosley, he was the guy that came up originally from 135. Juan Manuel Marquez, he was never the heaviest dude either. Once again, this is not to take credit away from Floyd Mayweather Jr., but once again, I just hear narratives here and there that say, oh, well, Floyd, he fights people who are always 20 pounds heavier. That's a bunch of horse shit. That's never usually happened. There were some fighters, all in all, that were decently bigger, but when people try to tell you overall that happened, 90% of the time that he fought fighters that were 20 to 30 pounds heavier, no, that was not the case.
Were much bigger than him in some of his most impressive wins. Floyd Mayweather has beat more fighters on the pound-for-pound list than any other fighter. I mean, just to understand how impressive that is.
I believe that's true as well.
Imagine if there was a fighter today that had beat 4 to 6 fighters on the current pound-for-pound list today, no matter what your pound-for-pound list is. Just imagine.
Well, I don't think that I don't think all in all that you can ever defeat, those fighters overall on the current pound for pound list, because one would think all in all that if you suffer a loss you're going to go down. But it is what it is. The only other fighter that I can even compare to Floyd Mayweather Jr. today is going to be a Canelo Alvarez, because he defeated Gennady Golovkin, who was a top 5 pound for pound fighter. Sergey Kovalev, I'm not going to necessarily call him a top 10 pound for pound fighter, but he would have been within a top 20. Araceli Lara, you could have debated maybe at one point in time, and then of course there was a couple of other fighters as well.
Imagine
like Canelo's resume compared with anyone else today. When talking about a fighter that's fighting in their prime, Canelo's resume, it really doesn't even compare with anyone else. His resume is so far above anyone else's.
You would be saying about a fighter that was able to accomplish something like that. I told you guys in one of my recent videos, people always try to say, oh, Canelo, he's just doing all the same things that Floyd Mayweather did. And I explained to you, actually, he's doing the opposite. Canelo Alvarez is often fighting guys coming off of their worst performances. Floyd Mayweather...
No, that's not true. It's just you tried to spread that narrative because you don't like Canelo because he's not a black fighter. Let's be real. Because once again, Dante, he's a pro-black cult member. It is what it is. No, Canelo does not fight people usually off of their worst performances. He fought Sergey Kovalev off of 2 very good performances over 2 very decent light heavyweight fighters. He fought Billy Joe Saunders, off of a very good performance over Martin Murray. He fought Callum Smith coming off of a very decent performance. He fought Austin Trout coming off of a win over Miguel Cotto. He fought Araceli Lara coming off of a win, I believe, over Austin Trout. Either that or Ngulu. 2 very, decent performances by Lara, even though he was, very competitive in the Ngulu fight because he was not as defensively responsible as he should have been. But it is what it is. All right. Canelo fought Miguel Cotto coming off of a very decent performance. All right. So it is what it is. Miss me with this bullshit overall to where, oh, Canelo, he only fights people coming off their worst performances. That's a bunch of horse shit.
Was always fighting someone coming off of their biggest win.
But Gervonta Tank Davis, he can fight Rolly Romero, a person who looked like shit in his last fight, never defeated any elite name, and he's perfectly okay with that fight happening. Like, come on.
And when I talked about this in a previous video, some of you guys said, well, hey, what about Zab Judah? He didn't fight him coming off of his biggest win. And that's true, he didn't. Zab was the only one. But in that situation...
Zab Judah actually gave a lot of good fighters out there very tough fights. Unfortunately, Zab Judah, he'll probably be remembered as, a gatekeeper because that's pretty much all he was. But Zab Judah, when it comes down to it, he was very physically talented, but a lot like Adrian Broner, very physically talented. In my opinion, Zab Judah was actually more skilled than Adrian Broner. I think that all around he had more of a skill set than what Adrian Broner has, because I thought Zab Judah had better feet. I thought Zab Judah had better head movement. I would say that he also had better speed. The only thing I would say that Adrian Broner actually beat Zab Judah in probably would be all-around ability to take damage, and on top of that, maybe strength, because he's pretty decently big. He was bigger than what Zab Judah was. Zab Judah was a very decently skilled fighter, but he was not a guy that could adapt, and he would always fold mentally. That was the biggest problem with Zab Judah. It is what it is. Like, I watched this one channel, and there's a certain amount of channels that have influenced my channel when it comes down, and I always give them credit. One of the channels that I should give credit as well to, Hatman Strikes Back, Boxing Wave, all in all, they're very decent channels. I'm trying to think if there's any others. Couple others that maybe I'm not, mentioning. Chronicles of Judah 144, that's also another decent channel. I don't always agree with everything that all these guys say, but all in all, they're very decently logical and objective, and I like these channels. Chronicles of Judah, some people, they mention him on my channel, and they ask, well, do you know his channel? Yes, I do. Certainly do. Chronicles of Judah 144 is a very decent channel. Very decently logical and objective the majority of the time. I remember one time when I was hearing his conversation about Zab Judah, and he said that he thought that the biggest problem with Zab Judah was that he didn't really have the chin. Zab Judah could be knocked out, but I'm not necessarily going to say that his chin was the problem, because I seen him against very tough fighters that could punch like a truck, like Miguel Cotto and Danny Garcia and some other guys like that, and he usually lasted quite long against them. It's not like he got knocked out within like a few rounds like Amir Khan or something like that. It's just Zab Judah, he just could not adjust very well. Once the pressure was on, he always folded mentally. He just never knew what to do. That's why he pretty much lost almost every big fight in his career. But Zab Judah was very physically gifted. You know, he would give you a hell of a first 4 or 5 rounds. Even Floyd Mayweather Jr., like, he was debatably winning the first half of that fight against Floyd, but Floyd adjusted.
Floyd Mayweather and Zab Judah, they were scheduled to fight next, assuming Zab Judah got past Carlos Valdemir. At the time,
which he didn't.
Mayweather versus Zab Judah was like the biggest fight. It was one of the biggest fights in the entire sport. So what happened? Zab Judah, he loses to Carlos Valdemir. Floyd Mayweather, he ends up fighting against Zab Judah. But who did he fight after he beat Zab Judah? The guy that beat Carlos Valdemir. Once again, a guy coming off of the biggest win of his career, right? Now, if Floyd Mayweather would have only went after the loser and he didn't fight the guy that beat Zab Judah, then that would be a bad look.
Right, but why are you trying to pretend that Canelo Alvarez did this? Like, you're acting like Canelo Alvarez isn't facing champions and is only facing guys coming off the biggest loss in their career. Like, come on, man.
Comes to Floyd, but he didn't do that. He did what you're supposed to do. He beat this man, and then he beat the man that beat him. Now listen, guys, when it comes to...
Miguel Cotto was one of my favorite boxers to watch. Miguel Cotto might be the greatest gatekeeper of all time. He might be the greatest gatekeeper of all time because Miguel Cotto, if you were not the creme de la creme, you were not going to defeat Miguel Cotto, even if you were a high, A-class level boxer like a Shane Mosley. Like, I thought Miguel Cotto clearly outboxed Shane Mosley. That was a very tough fight, by the way, but I watched it recently. I think I scored it 8 rounds to 4 for Miguel Cotto. There were so many people that thought Shane Mosley should have won that fight. No, if you know how to score a fight, Miguel Cotto clearly won that fight. But it is what it is. Like Miguel Cotto, I have not watched a whole lot of the old, like really old former Puerto Rican fighters, like the one that fought Salvador Sanchez. I can't remember his name. And then, of course, you had that one Benitez in the 80s who pretty much lost a lot of the bigger fights like the Sugar Ray Leonard and all those other guys. Miguel Cotto, just in terms of the fighters that I've seen, Miguel Cotto might be the most talented Puerto Rican boxer that I've personally ever seen. I would have to watch some of the older guys, but just in terms of the generations that I've seen, like from the 90s onward, and I was not really watching boxing in the 90s, of course, because I was born in the 90s, but when it came down to it all in all, I've watched a certain amount of Felix Trinidad's fights. I think Miguel Cotto, just in terms of boxing skills, I think all in all that he was all around better than Felix Trinidad. I think that he had better feet. I thought that he had a better jab. His left hook was also phenomenal. Miguel Cotto was one of the hardest punchers in history. He was one of the best boxers in history, in my opinion. Very underrated boxer when you talk about in terms of his skill set. But Miguel Cotto, of course, did fall short sometimes against Mayweather and Pacquiao and Canelo. He had a couple of other losses in his career as well, but Miguel Cotto, he beat a certain amount of very good fighters as well. 4-division champion. Like Miguel Cotto, in my opinion, I'm not going to necessarily 100% put him on that same level with Tommy Hearns, but he's somewhere within that top 50 range, in my opinion, because Miguel Cotto, he kind of reminded me of like a Tommy Hearns of this generation. You know, some people may disagree, but Tommy Hearns, he lost a lot of the bigger fights in his career. Well, I'm not going to 100% compare him to Tommy Hearns because Tommy Hearns, I do think that he beat Sugar Ray Leonard in that second fight. I can't ever say that Miguel Cotto, that he, beat one of the number one pound-for-pound fighters in his generation. I'm not going to say that, but Miguel Cotto, like I said, he really, all in all, was one of the all-time great, like, elite gatekeepers. Like, Miguel Cotto, he's an A-class gatekeeper. There's certain people, all in all, that, they're kind of lower-grade gatekeepers, like a Zab Judah. He's more of a stepping stone. Miguel Cotto was like, if you're not the creme de la creme, you're not going to beat him. Miguel Cotto was a very special fighter.
Conversations of who's greater out of Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao, those conversations are really not up for debate. The only reason why people even talk about this is because of the racism that exists in the sport of boxing. Because if racism didn't exist, no one would be trying to compare the loser to the winner.
I agree with you partially, but it also depends because you have a certain amount of people that would debate that Marvin Hagler is over Sugar Ray Leonard, even though Sugar Ray Leonard got that win over him. You have some people that would debate all in all that, I'm trying to think of like other debates, like even in basketball, you have some debates that LeBron James is greater than Michael Jordan. when it comes down to it. I don't necessarily always agree with these comparisons, but you do have some people that would debate that. And Manny Pacquiao, at the end of the day, I would not personally call him the greatest fighter of all time, but I understand why some people don't know. They believe that because he is an A division champion, and the majority of the time when he fought big class competition, he usually won.
The reason why the whole world wanted to watch this fight, because this fight was going to determine who's the best fighter of this era. Even Freddie Roach admitted that if Floyd Mayweather beats Manny Pacquiao, Floyd is considered the best of this era, hands down. Matter of fact, let me play the clip.
Now, Freddie, obviously, you believe Manny Pacquiao is going to win the fight. I'm just saying, hypothetically, something that's not supposed to happen actually occurs that night, and Floyd wins the fight decisively. 2 questions. If Manny Pacquiao wins the fight, where do you rate him as an all-time great? If Mayweather wins the fight, same question.
I think it's a good win for Mayweather if he wins the fight. Pacquiao is, again, I think, if you want to go with the history of boxing and go with all the boxers out there that from ever, are you talking about the best of ever or the best of just his era? I think he might be the best fighter for his era. Yes.
Like top 20, top 15,
No,
top 5?
Best fighter of his era right now. Because he's undefeated, very good.
Okay, so that was an interview I did with Freddie Roach at his gym right before the Mayweather versus Pacquiao fight. Do you guys notice when I asked him the question, if Manny Pacquiao wins or if Floyd Mayweather wins, where do you rate them? Do you guys notice he never even mentioned Manny Pacquiao's name? He only talked about Floyd Mayweather. In fact, he was talking as if Floyd had already beat Manny Pacquiao. He was saying Floyd Mayweather is definitely the best fighter of this era. I think Freddie Roach always felt deep down Floyd Mayweather was going to beat his fighter Manny Pacquiao.
Possibly.
Remember when this fight was first signed, the first thing Freddie Roach said is this is going to be a very difficult fight. It's going to be a difficult fight to win. Floyd Mayweather doesn't make too many mistakes. This is exactly what he said. So while Freddie Roach is damn near panicking, Floyd Sr. and Floyd Mayweather, they're talking with all the confidence in the world. And the fight played out just like that, with the most confident fighter winning. So you racists out there, boy, that's...
Let me say this overall, though. Floyd Mayweather Jr., he was a little bit afraid overall of Manny Pacquiao. What I am going to say is this. I'm not going to necessarily say that he was ducking him. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that he knew that Manny Pacquiao fight, that was the biggest fight of his life. And he knew that Manny Pacquiao, that he's a special type of fighter. And I understand that Floyd Mayweather Jr., that he handled him, I'm not going to say easily, but he was able to decisively beat Manny Pacquiao. But Floyd Mayweather Jr., that whole entire fight, very, very alert, very focused, as he is with pretty much all of his fights anyway. But I've never seen Floyd as alert and as focused as he was with that Manny Pacquiao fight.
You gotta hurt your feelings when you hear even Manny Pacquiao's trainer admitting that Floyd Mayweather is better. You can't argue against this man's trainer telling you that Floyd Mayweather is better. But you know what? Just to beat a dead horse, let me really break this down to where even a racist can understand it. So
you're a racist as well, Dante. So once again, Dante, he can try to explain all this shit when it comes down to it, but at the end of the day, Dante, you're a racist as well. Let's just stop.
His fans. I want you guys to imagine the man you hate right now, Floyd Mayweather, right? Imagine if Floyd Mayweather had already been knocked out 2 times. I'm talking about before he became a superstar. He had already been knocked out twice. He fights Juan Manuel Marquez 4 times and struggles every single time he fights him. And in the 4th fight, Floyd gets knocked out cold by Juan Manuel Marquez. Then Manny Pacquiao comes along and he completely dominates Marquez in 1 fight. Then after the world has been asking for this Mayweather versus Pacquiao fight for so many years.
I understand the point that Dante is trying to make, and I think that he's partially correct. But there are some boxing debates in history to where people kind of make the same thing. Like, we can talk about Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano. Many people would say that Joe Louis, he only lost to Rocky Marciano because he was old. Because Joe Louis, he got his ass kicked against Rocky Marciano. Not only that, but he lost to another black fighter, I believe, overall of his time. Now, Rocky Marciano, of course, he wasn't the black fighter. I'm just saying, all in all, that Joe Louis, he lost to one of the best black fighters of his era when he finally fought him. I think it was Ezra Charles, but if I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. He lost to one of those guys. Now, Rocky Marciano, he was undefeated. Not only did he defeat Joe Louis, but he defeated all the other great fighters of his era, even some of the fighters that defeated Joe Louis. Now, there really should be no debate in my mind overall about who is greater between Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis, but you still have many people that would debate Joe Louis over Rocky Marciano. So it is what it is. I won it, but it's whatever.
They finally get in the ring, and Manny Pacquiao beats Floyd Mayweather. Race fans, be honest in your heart right now. Regardless of how many accomplishments Floyd Mayweather has, would you be calling Floyd Mayweather greater than Manny Pacquiao in that scenario? And we already know the answer. You know, I ran into a brother out here in Thailand who's actually a fighter, and he's a fan of my channel. And we started talking boxing, and he was telling me how people are saying that Manny Pacquiao is actually greater than Floyd Mayweather. And I asked him the same scenario that I asked you guys. I said, if Floyd Mayweather had been knocked out 3 times, lost to Manny Pacquiao, got knocked out by Marquez, would there be anybody saying that Floyd Mayweather was the greatest fighter of all time, or even greater than the guy he lost to, Manny Pacquiao?
It depends if the roles were reversed. It depends if Floyd Mayweather Jr. was a multiple-time champion. And yes, all in all, there would be some people overall that would be debating that Floyd would be greater than Manny, even in that situation. There's people all in all that debate that Sugar Ray Leonard is not as great as Marvin Hagler. And Sugar Ray Leonard not only beat Marvin Hagler, he all in all, I believe, was like a 4-weight division champion. Marvin Hagler, I'm not even sure if he was ever a champion, even outside his own middleweight division. So, yes, you do have some people all in all that are going to debate that.
I asked this guy.
I mean, shit. Take a look overall, Roy Jones Jr. versus Bernard Hopkins. You got people that debate that Bernard Hopkins is greater than Roy Jones Jr., which in my opinion is a goddamn circus show, but it is what it is.
This question, he said no. And this guy was on some coon shit, and he still said no. So like I said, man, if we're...
What did he say? Anyway.
Being realistic, it's not even up for debate. People only have these conversations because of the racism that exists in the sport of boxing. I tell you guys all the time, boxing is based...
I agree with you partially, Dante, when it comes down to it, but at the end of the day, there are certain conversations that happen, all in all, even between 2 black fighters. Now, some would debate overall that, that still could have a racial thing, but even discussions between 2 black fighters, there are debates, all in all, about who is greater between Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano, or Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali. Now, once again, Rocky Marciano was not a black fighter. But Rocky Marciano, he was a Caucasian fighter. There are many people that would debate that Joe Louis was greater than Rocky Marciano. I personally would not debate that. But it is what it is.
On race, nationality.
There are also certain people that would debate Marvin Hagler over Sugar Ray Leonard. I also would not debate that. But there's a lot of people out there that would.
Pride in that order. And we see this play out every day in the sport of boxing. Do you ever notice whenever people try to give Floyd Mayweather backhand compliments by calling him the greatest defensive fighter of all time, do you guys notice they never talk about who's the best offensive fighter of all time? They don't do it because they made up this ridiculous term to kind of discredit Floyd Mayweather. If you think about it, Floyd Mayweather is also the best offensive fighter because we're talking about...
You can debate that.
About numbers. Who is the most accurate puncher in the sport of boxing? It's Floyd Mayweather. Who lands the highest percentage of punches? It's Floyd Mayweather. How do you think Floyd Mayweather outlanded every single fighter that he has faced?
Well, I don't know if he actually has outlanded every single fighter that he's faced. He didn't outland Marcos Maidana in their first fight. He didn't outland Jose Luis Castillo. Of course, you can't always trust those punch stats. But when it comes down to it, that does not always mean that you don't win the fight. Bottom line is this. Floyd Mayweather Jr. was a phenomenal offensive and defensive fighter. To be as great as a Floyd Mayweather Jr., you have to be great on both ends.
Because you can't win fights with defense alone. These are code words they only use for black fighters. How come they never call Willie Pep the best defensive fighter of all time? How come they
Actually, there is some people that would debate that. But it is what it is.
never call Lomachenko one of the greatest defensive fighters of all time? We know what time.
Well, right, but Lomachenko, he also is a purely offensive fighter. Lomachenko is a person that tends to be sometimes, defensively irresponsible. But we all know what Lomachenko is mainly going to try to do. He's going to try to go in there. He's going to try to pressure you to the point of breaking. So it is what it is.
It is. But like I said, numbers don't lie.
I'm not saying that Floyd Mayweather Jr., that he didn't do that at some times, but there was also a certain amount of fights where he would fight on the back foot and be a little bit more defensive. There's no problem with that. But it is what it is. But I understand what Dante's getting at.
For these racists saying that Floyd Mayweather is the best defensive fighter in the world, it helps ease the pain when they have to admit that this man is the best. Now let's talk about Manny Pacquiao being listed number 2 as the greatest fighter of all time? So you mean to tell me all this time we've been saying that Sugar Ray Robinson or Muhammad Ali is the greatest of all time, and then just like that, a man that actually loses to Floyd Mayweather, he's supposed to be greater than all of them? The logic makes no sense. See, this is what you guys have to understand.
What I'm going to say is this. Once again, would I rank him at number 2? I'm not sure if I would, but you can debate it. Like I said, Manny Pacquiao is up there with almost anybody. When we talk about it, Sugar Ray Robinson suffered several losses in his career, as did Muhammad Ali, as did a couple of those other fighters. So it is what it is.
What makes fighters like Floyd Mayweather, Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Pernell Whitaker, Sugar Ray Leonard, you know what really made these fighters greats? I mean, top of the level, elite greats. You know what really made them greats? Was the fact that they won the most important fights of their career.
Well, I agree, but Manny Pacquiao also won the majority of the most important fights in his career. Like, this guy tries to act like that's why I say Bernard Hopkins is way too high on that list. Manny Pacquiao, he's beaten the majority of the big fights in his career, besides Mayweather and a couple of others. But he beat Marquez, he beat Antonio Barrera, he beat overall Eric Morales, he beat Miguel Cotto, he beat Ricky Hatton, he beat Shane Mosley, all right? He beat, I'm trying to think who else, Keith Thurman, Timothy Bradley. He beat all these guys. Like, it's not like he was just a Roberto Duran, and Roberto was great in his own sense, but let's also be real about Roberto Duran. Usually when he went up the weight classes, he usually lost the bigger fights in his career. That's just the facts. He lost to Benitez, he lost to Hearns, all right? He lost to Sugar Ray Leonard twice, all right? He lost to Hagler, and from what I hear, it was a very decently competitive fight. He lost to Vinny Pazienza, He lost to Hector Macho Camacho. From what I heard, was controversial in one of those fights, but the majority of the time he lost. At least when Manny Pacquiao, when he moved up the weight divisions, he usually won. That's one thing I'll say about Manny Pacquiao.
Pacquiao is definitely a great fighter, but let's be honest. What are the 2 biggest fights of his career? The 2 biggest fights of his career was Floyd Mayweather and Juan Manuel Marquez. Manny Pacquiao, he fought Marquez 4 times.
Right, but he also has a couple wins over Marquez. So let's not try to discredit over Manny Pacquiao. All right? And there's a couple of fighters that he beat that you can debate were greater than Marquez. You can debate that Miguel Cotto was greater than Marquez. And some people would disagree, but it is what it is. All right? Marquez was a great fighter. Don't get it twisted. But, when it comes down to it, Manny Pacquiao is the top 10 boxer of all time. I have no doubt about that whatsoever.
Muhammad Ali, he fought Joe Frazier 3 times. That is a serious rivalry. And Manny Pacquiao, he lost that rivalry against Marquez. Got knocked out by this man.
No, he didn't really lose when it comes down to it, because he has 2 wins over him. He has a draw and he has a loss. Now, you can debate that Marquez should have won overall when it came down to, 2 out of 4 of those fights at least when it comes down to it. But the first one, I'd have no problem with the draw. Manny Pacquiao knocked him down 3 times. So, you can't disagree with the draw when it comes down to it. Then the second fight, I thought Manny Pacquiao won. The third fight, I thought personally Marquez won. And the fourth fight, of course, Marquez knocked him out. But Manny Pacquiao, he has at least 1 win over Juan Manuel Marquez. And on top of that, he usually won some of the more bigger fights in his career than what, Juan Manuel Marquez had. So because Marquez, he lost some of the bigger fights in his career as well.
Now, granted, I will say that Manny Pacquiao, he definitely has some big wins, though. I would say his two biggest wins, with no controversy, was his trilogy that he won against Eric Morales and his win over Marco Antonio Barrera. Those, to me, are his biggest two wins of his career.
That's a great win, but I would even possibly put the Miguel Cotto win over that, because you can debate that Miguel Cotto, at least in my opinion, was greater fighters than those guys. Some certain people would debate that, but Miguel Cotto was a highly skilled fighter.
But unfortunately for Manny Pacquiao, he lost the most important fight of his career, and that was the fight of the century against Floyd Mayweather. That's what it was billed. The fight of the...
That's fair. I have no problem with that. So if you wanted to say that Manny Pacquiao is not above a Floyd Mayweather Jr., that's fair. But when we compare him to other fighters, when we compare him even to like a Roberto Duran, now I understand that Roberto Duran, he beat Sugar Ray Leonard, but the majority of the other times, like almost every other time when you moved up in weight, you pretty much lost every big fight in your career. So I can't have Roberto Duran over Manny Pacquiao. Roy Jones Jr., would I have him over Manny Pacquiao? That's certainly debatable. Sugar Ray Leonard, certainly could debate that and have no problem with that. Rocky Marciano, Muhammad Ali, don't really have a problem with that. But Manny Pacquiao, he's kind of in that Muhammad Ali realm. To where, you know, Muhammad Ali, he certainly was the greatest heavyweight of his era, but he does have a couple losses. So it is what it is.
The century. Can you imagine the pressure that was on Manny Pacquiao going into that fight? Right? You can't be greater than fighters like, once again, Sugar Ray Robinson, Sugar Ray Leonard, and all the other names I mentioned, because those fighters, they actually won the most important fights of their career. Sugar Ray Leonard, he beat Durant.
Right, but Manny Pacquiao is not just some Shane Mosley or Oscar De La Hoya. You know, excuse me, and no offense against them, like I said, who just lost every A-class fight in their career almost. You know, and Oscar, he won some A-class fights in his career, debatably, but when it came down to the overall, you know, and what I mean by debatably is that, you know, some of them were controversial, but he also did lose a lot of the big A-class fights that he was in. Manny Pacquiao, one thing that you can say about him, he's beaten a hell of a lot of champions. Like, this dude is no joke. The man beat Eric Morales, who was a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. He beat Juan Manuel Marquez. He beat Marco Antonio Barrera. He beat Miguel Cotto. He beat Timothy Bradley. He beat Keith Thurman. All right, he beat all these guys. All right, and, you know, there's a couple of other wins that I'm not even mentioning right now that I'm probably forgetting. Manny Pacquiao has an all-time great resume. There's no doubt about that.
And in the trilogy, he beat Hagler. He beat Hearns.
He's on that level, in my opinion, with Muhammad Ali and Roberto Duran. He's on that level.
He beat Wilfredo Benitez. Ali beat Frazier, Sonny Liston, George Foreman, right? Pernell Whitaker. He won the most important fights of his career. Andre Ward.
I can't say that Pernell Whitaker is above Manny Pacquiao. I like Pernell, but, you know, Pernell, even though he was a great fighter, you can also argue that he lost some of the bigger fights in his career as well. I personally thought he beat Oscar, but at the end of the day, it was a close fight, and he ended up losing that fight. He also lost to Felix Tito Trinidad. It is what it is. The Julio Cesar Chavez fight, of course, I thought he personally won, but, you know, it is what it is.
Bernard Hopkins. All of these guys.
Bernard Hopkins is not over Manny Pacquiao. Stop that shit right now. Bernard Hopkins ain't in the top 20. I hate to tell people that. He ain't in the top 20. Hate to tell people that, but that's just the facts. I mean, shit, you want to talk about a person that never won any of the big fights in his career, unless against A-class fighters. You know, Joe Calzaghe, Chad Dawkins, you know, Jermaine Taylor, Roy Jones Jr. Man lost to almost everyone who was A-class. Like, just stop.
Won the most important fights of their career. So you can't even put Manny Pacquiao in the top 10. I mean,
that's stupid. Yes, of course you can. But Dante, once again, he doesn't know shit about boxing, so that really don't surprise me. You'd put Bernard Hopkins above Manny Pacquiao, that tells me that you have no idea what the hell you're talking about. Because who did Bernard Hopkins really beat? Who's the greatest fighter that he beat? Like, the greatest fighter that... I'm trying to think all I know who he beat. The greatest fighter that he beat was Felix Tito Trinidad. Now, Felix Tito Trinidad, at one point in time, maybe would have been thought of as the number one pound-for-pound fighter. I'm not sure if I would debate him that, though. I'd say that at the time it would have been Roy Jones. But, you know, there's certain fighters on Manny Pacquiao's resume, all in all, that, you know, were very, very highly skilled when it comes down to it. And in my opinion, Manny Pacquiao, yes, he has to be rated over Bernard Hopkins, because it's no offense against Bernard Hopkins, but when he usually fought fighters that were near his own same size and were just as talented as he was, maybe if not more, he usually lost. That's the facts of the matter. At least with Manny Pacquiao, I can say that Manny Pacquiao, when he went up in weight classes and was even actually smaller than these dudes, he usually beat them. I can't say that about Bernard Hopkins.
And it would be generous to put him at the bottom 10, but I could definitely tell you there are at least 10 other fighters that won the most important fights of their career. And Manny Pacquiao is not one of them, at least not one to do it consistently.
Yes, he is. That's a very stupid statement, but it is what it is. I understand where Dante's getting at a little bit, but at the bottom line is this. Manny Pacquiao, at one point in time, when Floyd Mayweather Jr. retired, even when he came back, Manny Pacquiao was looked at as the number one pound-for-pound fighter. And he was consistently beating champion after champion after champion after champion, or at least certain fighters overall that at one point in time had held belts. Bernard Hopkins, he beat certain fighters, but I can't say all in all that he won every big matchup in his career, or 90% of them like a Manny Pacquiao. Manny Pacquiao beat some all-time great fighters, some first ballot Hall of Famers, no doubt about it. Bernard won some big fights as well, like against Oscar, but let's be real. I mean, to me, and some people may disagree, to me that has a little bit of an asterisk next to it, because Oscar never should have been in that weight class in the first place. You beat Felix Trinidad, that's a great win, especially because Trinidad was favored over Bernard Hopkins, so I give Hopkins credit for that. And he also beat Kelly Pavlik. Those are the best wins in his career. But how many people are going to look at Kelly Pavlik overall and say, wow, Kelly Pavlik is a top 30 or top 50 boxer of all time? Not many. You know what I'm saying? Like, when you went up against Roy Jones, when you went up against Joe Calzaghe, when you went up against Jermaine Taylor, Chad Dawkins, even Sergey Kovalev a little bit later on, you lost every single time. It is what it is. He could never be in the top 10 of all time. Never. He can never be compared to a Manny Pacquiao.
Again, he got the win over Barrera. He got the win over Morales, right? And when it comes to like a lot of his other wins, like wins over Shane Mosley, Ricky Hatton, Margarito, and all of these guys, just like Canelo's situation, the majority of those guys were coming off of recent losses or knockout losses, right? So
why are you trying to act like certain fighters, when they fought Canelo, like almost every fighter, that they were coming off of knockout losses or recent losses? Was Billy Joe Saunders coming off of a recent loss? Was Danny Jacobs really coming off of that recent of a loss? I mean, of course he lost to Gennady Golovkin, but that was a very close fight. I thought Gennady Golovkin just pulled it out. But Danny Jacobs, all in all, no, he was not recently coming off of a loss. Sergey Kovalev came off of a loss about 3 fights ago before he fought Canelo, but he was also coming off of 2 very decent wins. So let's just stop. Now, the Manny Pacquiao thing, that's a little bit more understandable, but the fighters that he beat still were very, very decent. When he defeated Miguel Cotto was a very decent fighter. When he defeated Marco Antonio Barrera and Eric Morales and Timothy Bradley, all those guys were decent fighters. Juan Manuel Marquez, Keith Thurman, all these guys, all right? It is what it is. Even Shea Mosley to a degree, even though he was a bit older. But it is what it is.
Oh, those were good wins. They weren't as impressive as Manny Pacquiao once again beating a Barrera or a Morales, because those guys at the time, they weren't coming off of being knocked out. They were in their prime when Manny Pacquiao beat them.
Let's also talk about how many fighters that some of these guys defeated on the top 10 pound-per-pound list. Now, Sugar Ray Leonard, he defeated a lot of fighters that were on the pound-per-pound list. He defeated Hagler, he defeated Duran, and he also defeated Hearns. And I think he also defeated Benitez. I'm not sure, however, high he was on the list. But all those fighters were very, very decent fighters. But let's also talk about this. He beat, I believe, Marquez when Marquez maybe was counted as a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. He beat Eric Morales and Marco Antonio Barrera. Those were 2 fighters that at one point in time were on the top 10 pound-for-pound list. He also beat Timothy Bradley, that at one point in time was on the top 10 pound-for-pound list. All right, so it is what it is. Even Miguel Cotto at one point in time, even though I don't think he was top 10 pound-for-pound at the time. But it is what it is.
Okay, so now we'll move on to Carlos Monzone. Now, guys, let me just...
Carlos Monsoon, in my opinion, is a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter of time. You notice that Dante's Boxing Nation, he has no problem with any of the black fighters being at top 10 pound-for-pound. But as soon as he sees a Latino or anyone who's not an American black fighter, all of a sudden he has this huge problem. Carlos Monsoon beat everyone, all in all, that he fought. So the losses that he had, he always avenged them. Carlos Monsoon was a great fighter.
Let's make this clear. I noticed this pattern. Every single time, old media, they do the right thing by putting the right guy at the number one spot. They always make sure they put some ridiculous names right below his name. They did this when they rated Floyd Mayweather as the greatest fighter in the last 25 years. It's almost as if they feel that as long as they put Floyd Mayweather's name at number one, they can sneak in whatever name they want undetected. Nobody will really notice it. That ain't happening.
Carlos Monsoon, some of you overall should check him out. Carlos Monsoon is debatably the greatest middleweight of all time. He's up there with Marvin Hagler. A certain amount of people, they may disagree, but it is what it is. Carlos Monsoon was an all-time great fighter, no doubt about it.
Once again, man, do you know how disrespectful it is? Everyone has been calling Sugar Ray Robinson the greatest fighter of all time. And out of nowhere, you decide to just put Carlos Manzone above him? Guys, you know how...
You know, if that would have been Marvin Hagler, I wonder all in all how disrespectful you think all in all it would have been. Let's be real, Dante. The only reason why you have a problem with Carlos Monsoon being that high is because he's a Latino fighter and he's not the type of complexion that you want there. It is what it is. Now, would I necessarily agree with putting Carlos Monsoon above Sugar Ray Robinson? I don't know, but Carlos Monsoon, he certainly was the best of his division and one of the greatest of his era. So I don't necessarily have a huge problem with that.
You always hear these race fans use these code words whenever a black fighter is chasing a Latino fighter or someone who's not black. What do they always say? To protect the guy who's running, these race fans, they always use these code words. Well, who did he fight? Who did the black guy fight, right? Like implying that they don't want the black fighter to get his hands on that guy because he ain't fought nobody, right? At least this is what they always say. They always ask this question. The funny thing is, that question should not apply when the guy who's chasing him wants to fight him. You should only be asking a question like that in a case like this where we're talking about fighters that are perceived as the greatest of all time or top 10, one of the greatest, whatever the case. That's when you ask the question, who has he fought? Who has he beat? You don't say that when there's a guy out there that wants all the smoke. Because if these guys stop ducking, then we will know who he beat. I mean, just imagine one of...
Right, but Dante, you like to put a lot of people in your top 10 pound for pound who have never fought anybody. Like, you like to put Shakur Stevenson and Gervonta Tank Davis in your top 10 pound for pound. And those two, I think, are very talented fighters. But who have they fought? I mean, Gervonta Tank Davis, I mean, let's be real. You know, besides Leo Santa Cruz, how many elite fighters have you really fought? When it comes to Shakur Stevenson, he just recently defeated Jamel Herring, but how many elite fighters have you really fought? Terrence Crawford. Terrence Crawford, I think, is a great fighter as well. But let's be real. How many A-class fighters has he really fought? Almost none. Really, you can argue none. So it is what it is.
These boxers chasing another boxer down the street. This man running for his life, and he turning around, looking at the dude who's chasing him, and he says, who have you beat? While he running his ass off. Does that make any sense? Of course not. So when it comes to Carlos Manzone, who did he beat? Where are the Manny Pacquiao names? Where are the Canelo Alvarez names? Where are the Haglers, the Hearns, the Sugar Ray Leonards, the Fraziers?
It's so interesting all in all that they always mention Bernard Hopkins' title defenses and Marvin Hagler's, but then when it comes to Carlos Monsoon, at least these guys, you know, they failed to mention it. Carlos Monsoon was an all-time great fighter, no doubt about it.
Where are those names on this man's record? They are not there. If you look up Carlos Monzone's record, you'll see a whole bunch of fighters with like 22 losses, 30 losses, 15 losses. Just go to BoxRec right now.
Right, but every fighter all in all that had 30 losses or 22 losses or, you know, something like that, they were not always bad fighters. Take a look at Sugar Ray Robinson's record. He fought a lot of bums too. It is what it is. Like, everyone thinks that Sugar Ray Robinson just always fought the best of the best. You know, he always has a, you know, people always say he has like 100-something and, you know, this. There was a lot of bums that Sugar Ray Robinson fought. Like, there were certain fights that he would fight in a row, even during his heyday, where I think they would even have more losses than they would have wins. So go ahead and take a look at Sugar Ray Robinson's resume as well.
and look up Carlos Monzone's record. Look at his opponents. Who did this man beat? See, people want to praise him because he held the middleweight title for so long and he had all these title defenses. But
You mean the same way, all in all, that you gave Deontay Wilder all that credit because he had these 10 bullshit title defenses over bums of the month when it came down to it? That same way, Dante? And you're allegedly not a race fan? Okay.
defenses against who? He never defended against Marvin Hagler. And I'm not saying that he was...
He wasn't a part of the same generation, you dipshit. Oh, man. At least I don't believe that he was. Carlos Monsoon was around in the 70s. Marvin Hagler, overall, he got his heyday during the 80s. Like, what the hell are you talking about, dude?
Supposed to at the time. I'm not saying he ducked him, but once again, he does not have the names on his record. You could defend the title 100 times. If you're not fighting anyone, it doesn't really mean a whole lot.
I agree with that, but Carlos Monsoon, overall, he was a great fighter for his day. I would have to look at a couple of the names. My mind is drawing a blank right now, but he was an all-time great fighter. There's no doubt about that.
I keep talking about the important wins that you get in your career. And what are the important wins that Carlos Manzone got? It's not his fault, but Carlos Manzone, he didn't get any of the big names in the ring. So it's ridiculous to say that this man is top 3, the greatest fighter of all time over Sugar Ray Robinson and Muhammad Ali, and the list goes on and on and on. It makes no sense. Like I said, when it comes to Floyd Mayweather, I can tell you right now, there are a lot of people that Floyd Mayweather beat that would most likely beat a lot of these other fighters that are on this pound-for-pound greatest of all time list. For sure.
I highly doubt that. The only one overall that I could see beating the other top 10 pound-for-pounds would be, I would say, Manny Pacquiao. That'd be the only one.
Sure. You put them in the same weight class, same division. I'm not going to say Carlos Monzone would lose to all of them, but he wouldn't beat them all, that's for sure.
Who would he lose to? You should point him out. The only ones overall that I would predict maybe would be either Canelo or Manny Pacquiao.
It's not about how many wins you get. It's not about how many times you defend your title. It's about...
So why were you spreading all this bullshit about Deontay Wilder then? Or Terrence Crawford? Oh, he unified a division. That's cool. Who the hell did he unify it against? When it comes to the fighters that you like, Dante, you certainly sing a different tune.
Oh, who you beat. That's what it really comes down to at the end of the day. Now, when you combine who you beat with the impressive record, that's when that record means something.
I agree. So I have no idea why the hell you ever had Deontay Wilder in your top 10 pound per pound. That shows that you have no consistency in your ranking and you really have no idea what the hell you're talking about. But it is what it is.
But not if you don't have the names to go with the record. So at the end of the day, that is a huge statement for a website like BoxRec, because they're one of the most biased websites in boxing. For them to admit that Floyd Mayweather is the greatest of all time, that's huge. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
And that's really about it for today. But anyways, that's really pretty much it. I just thought that I would talk on that overall, where I believe Manny Pacquiao ranks and where Floyd Mayweather Jr. ranks. Manny Pacquiao, in my opinion, is one of the top 10 greatest fighters in history. The most overrated boxer that I always see on these lists is usually either Roberto Duran or Bernard Hopkins. But at least Roberto Duran won against Sugar Ray Leonard. Bernard Hopkins, don't get me wrong, Bernard Hopkins was a great fighter, but come on, man. This dude lost so many big fights in his career. He lost to Chad Dawkins, he lost to Jermaine Taylor, Joe Calzaghe, he lost to Roy Jones Jr. when he was at his peak. I don't even know if Bernard Hopkins would have beat, what the hell is that dude's name? James Toney. I don't even know if he would have beat him. Bernard Hopkins, don't get me wrong, he was a great fighter, but heavily, heavily overrated. No doubt about it. But that's pretty much all I got to say for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.